Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Before we begin, we wanted to acknowledge and thank all our listeners. We have recently surpassed 1,000 downloads of our podcast, and we are truly overwhelmed with the positive response. For any of our new listeners, welcome, and if you like what you hear, please consider leaving a rating or review. We really appreciate it. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Konstantin Tskhay, the Vice President of Organizational Effectiveness at Top Hat, an online teaching platform headquartered in Toronto, Canada. Diana and Konstantin begin their discussion by defining feedback, questioning when and where feedback is appropriate, and how to foster feedback in organizations. They continue their conversation by examining ways to manage interpersonal conflicts by focusing on the future rather than concentrating on the past. They conclude their discussion with the takeaway that a successful leader empowers their team, unlocking each individual's leadership potential, often resulting in better outcomes for the organization. Now let's have a conversation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Soft Skills Salon podcast. I am still Diana Kowarski, and I am delighted to have you here today. We are going to be having a dynamic and informative chat because, as I say, conversation is the currency of communication. And so let's have a conversation about soft skills today with my guest, Konstantin Tskhay. Konstantin Tskhay is a VP Organizational Effectiveness at Top Hat, bringing more than 10 years of experience in managing HR and project-based teams internally at an edtech company and delivering dozens of client engagements in human capital at Deloitte as a freelancer. Konstantin oversees compensation and benefits, talent management, learning and development, and strategic people analytics in his current VP role. He has worked at Top Hat for the past 3.5 years, leading a warp speed HR transformation, including HRIS implementation and configuration, talent management best practices, engagement assessments, and compensation programs. I think Konstantin has been quite bored for the last 3.5 years, guys. I really do. Konstantin holds a doctoral degree in psychology from the University of Toronto and is a widely published researcher in leadership and organizational behavior with research work in leadership and charisma. Hello and welcome, Konstantin.
Hi, Diana. How's it going?
It's going. Thank you. And thank you so much for being here. It's a real delight to have a chance to spend some time with you. You bring so much to the table. The HRIS implementation and configuration alone, I'm sure, took more than a little bit of your time over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been quite a journey creating the transformation for our organization, and soft skills definitely came in handy in there. So I'm excited to talk about it on your podcast.
There you go. Thank you so much. Thank you also for having gone through our soft skills impact questionnaire, which has all of 15 questions. Konstantin pre-selected a few that resonated with him, and we are going to start our conversation now with the first of those, which reads, how do you provide feedback to others, including colleagues, staff, and or leadership? What are your thoughts, Konstantin?
Just from the top of my head, I think this feedback is absolutely critical within organizations and just in general between different people. It's all about communication. And within the feedback framework, what I think about is what is the purpose of the feedback, right? So how are you going to help an individual and by providing your feedback and also stepping into their shoes and thinking about how that feedback is going to be received. And this goes both ways. So that is, if you are a person who gives a feedback, you have to be mindful of some of those things. But also when you are receiving the feedback, it's very easy to start reacting to it and sort of express the different feelings that are emerging in the moments versus, stepping back, actually taking the feedback in and learning from it. So I think it's a great learning experience. I think it's super great, but maybe to dive into answering the question around how do you provide feedback to people. So that is going from the person who sends the feedback. I think that's number one thing is that people should not be surprised when they receive the feedback. So that means feedback needs to be constant. It needs to be continuous. It needs to be happening on the ongoing basis, and it needs to be welcomed by the individual. And there's something to say about that in particular. There is a sense of inclusion and safety that needs to be created by the person who is giving the feedback, so that the feedback is received well. Some of the things that you can potentially do is ask the person, like, "Hey, can I provide you some feedback on this?" So that opens up a door for the individual to become more receptive, especially when they say, "Yes, I'm ready to receive your feedback." Or it also gives them an opportunity to say, "You know what, maybe not right now. Perhaps give me a little bit of time, and then I'll get back to you when I can, when I'll be in the right state of mind." I think
There's a lot there already, Konstantin. Thank you. Can we look at some of the layers of what it is you've already provided? So if I ask someone, may I provide you some feedback? And as you suggested, we have two avenues that you offered. One is, well, we get a write out yes, an agreement, in which case we can proceed. Or you offer the not now, maybe later option as the second route. And is there any strategy that you can provide in terms of how to follow up with that avenue if someone does respond with not now, and perhaps with a rationale or with some information of some particular specificity to that relationship or to that moment of feedback not being as opportune as possible? And the later, my question is, how do we define what that later looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, to me, coming from a very much, I would say, like, skills number 5 and 6 stood out in the 8 soft skills that you provided me with, is around the problem solving and innovation, creative thinking. So that a lot of it comes with planning. And so the way that I like to position this is, when you hear not now, maybe later, this is an opportunity to ask what later means for that individual. So, and this is an opportunity to say, well, perhaps we can do it tomorrow and schedule a meeting for it, or perhaps we can do it in a one-on-one. And this will essentially create that environment where you're setting a milestone in your day to actually set aside maybe 15, 30 minutes to talk about how things went. Like what went well, what didn't go well. And, a lot of times actually on that, people think about feedback as something negative, but there's also a lot of positive feedback. And I think that's one of the things that we very often overlook. There was a moment in my work at some point, is that I asked somebody, it's like, "Hey, can I provide you with feedback?" And this person just kind of stood there expecting the negative feedback. And I said, "This was amazing. Like this was such a great job that you did." And their face lit up, right? But it speaks to how we think about feedback as a negative, right? But it actually can be something positive. So
there's a lot going on there as well. So let's see about door number 3, because if we think about it, that question that is how we solidify some opportunities of establishing psychological safety and having feedback welcomed. If we ask, "May I provide you some feedback?" and the answer is yes, well, you're right. If feedback is culturally a neutral, it's a surprise, right? It could be great. It could be
That's
great.
Right.
If the response is no, maybe later, you've walked us through how some version of cementing what later means and or negotiating what that later looks like, so that we're not left with this unfulfilled question. Door number 3, however, is, well, what if we have the answer of no, thank you, I'm good, or the equivalent of that? How do we? Yeah.
Absolutely. And at that point, there's a sort of a decision that needs to be made within the individual who is providing that feedback, or one who is looking for an avenue to provide the feedback, is how critical is this feedback going to be to a grander, I would say, organizational health, but whatever initiatives that might be is leading, because sometimes you would have to provide that feedback, right? And that is going to be perhaps not a welcome feedback, and maybe there would need to be a new time identified, and maybe the approach would need to be like, hey, let's give this individual some time, maybe a few days, a week, and approach them again with the same conversation, the same request. So perhaps at that point in time, they weren't receptive to it. Maybe a little bit later, they would be more receptive.
So what I'm hearing with that option of no is that, one, we assess in and of ourselves what our purpose was, or perhaps what the value in terms of the work, whatever that work may have been, in moving forward, if we have not had a positive or at some point scheduled time at which to provide feedback. That's a regrouping opportunity, right?
That's right.
What is it that I was trying to achieve, and or is there potentially an opportunity to reassess if this feedback is of value to bring forward whatsoever? And in that sense, I think there's a lot to be said for the welcoming and of having been asked if one is open to feedback. And there's a value then if one is not being welcomed to provide feedback immediately, perhaps for some self-reflection. Sometimes when we are providing feedback in the moment, we haven't necessarily thought out our language choices or our vocabulary. So it can be an actual great benefit to us as a feedback provider for someone to say, all right, maybe not now, or even no, thank you, because we often think of that as a negative, and maybe that could be a positive. Does that make sense to you as well, Konstantin?
Yeah, absolutely. And, although there are not too many people who actually will say outright no to feedback, I haven't encountered many situations like that. But if they do, us as a feedback provider, we have to recognize that this is also feedback. And it goes bi-directionally, right? It is the feedback from the individual to us. And being on the receiving end of the feedback at that point, we have to step back and really think about, hey, do I actually need to provide this feedback? What purpose does it serve? Is this serving something important, or is this something that is not pleasing me personally, but is okay in a grander scheme of things? So it is an opportunity for reflection, like you said.
I appreciate that. And one of the first words that you use that I made note of when you began speaking about your response to this question was the word mindful. And I greatly appreciate that often the insinuation, or maybe the undercurrent with one choosing to be mindful, is it takes a bit of time, even a nanosecond of time, to be mindful. It's pretty rare to be spontaneously mindful. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, thinking through the different components, thinking through the feedback with granularity and specificity, I think is absolutely critical. A lot of times, there is a lack of clarity that comes with feedback, and I think and that's why I think it's actually a skill, as people can get better at it. But I think that specific feedback is always better than more general feedback. There's a lot of fuzzy words that people like to throw around when it comes to feedback, but the more specific and the more granular you get, the better feedback is going to be. But to actually get to that point, you have to actually think about it. And this is where mindfulness actually comes from.
Absolutely. I do some teaching through the Schulich School of Business as well as with my own organization. And That word specificity is one that I spend a lot of time saying. So I'm always really encouraged when I hear others using it as well. So one of the ways that I have worked with different organizations in terms of feedback and trying to develop both the skill, perhaps even the art of both offering and receiving it, is sometimes to liken it to goal setting. And so if a goal is being set in terms of one's performance, perhaps even included in an evaluative process of some sort, and that goal is to make the world a better place. And I'm all for that, although I have no idea what that means from one person to the next. That same macro approach to goal setting can be sometimes, unfortunately, used to feedback as well, which is the exact opposite of specificity. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I think about feedback is it typically needs to focus on the action, right? And it needs to focus on the very specific outcomes and specific actions that the individual is taking. And if we go for a very broad approach, like even with the positive example that I provided, it's like great job is a broad positive feedback, but to make it more specific is great job at delivering X, Y, and Z and doing it on time. And this way the person will receiving the feedback will know what are some of the things that you appreciate as an individual who's providing feedback. So that is timeliness, the doing the work very well and thoroughly, and also perhaps having like a positive attitude if we wanted to add, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on that specific example. So providing that feedback is more helpful to the individual because they're going to do more of those behaviors versus providing the feedback, hey, this was good job. Right. The individual might not know or might have a different idea what good job it looks like for them.
Absolutely. So on the demonstrable behaviors, what is being observed, feedback then can be much more specific and ideally comprehensive so that the recipient can know how to repeat, right?
That's right.
And I hear you. I think that there's a whole world of opportunity in there. Certainly at Top Hat, I'm sure with all of the HR transformation that you have been going through, and I assume continue to do, does feedback play a role within that culture that you have at Top Hat?
Yeah, absolutely. As a growing organization, we want to make sure that we are building the organization that is going to, the organization of the future, the organization that's going to be mature, the organization that's going to deliver on our ultimate mission of, changing the landscape of education and transforming it into a more digital environment where the professors and students are interacting in a very effective way. So from the feedback perspective, it is very important to build it into the culture of the organization and to make it okay to provide the feedback, whether it's being to the people who are directly reporting to you or to your colleagues or to the CEO. We want to make sure that we're creating that transparency and opening up those avenues. So with that, I think that there are several things, several processes that any organization can ultimately implement. Retrospective, like that's an excellent way to actually do to formalize the feedback within the organization. Working with individual contributors who are reporting to you, scheduling meetings that are separate from the one-on-ones that focus on work, that only focus on feedback and the development, as well as taking an opportunity to sit down with the leaders and ask some questions. And those questions also provide the feedback to the leadership and executive team around what are some of the areas within the organizations that are doing well, where is there a lack of clarity, and all of that is going to be feedback. But yeah, the biggest thing is ultimately creating that psychologically safe environment within the organization so that people are not afraid to ask those questions and actually want to provide that feedback.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'm a big proponent of the theme that I heard in your last few words of separating and seeing the value in the space between performance evaluation conversations versus professional development conversations, and where feedback can fit within both of those paradigms. However, separating them out as two distinct tasks can really help culturally for feedback to be further valued as a constant within an organization's culture. So
that's right, and in here, right, the critical part of it is that we're creating space for feedback that is separate from the conversations about work, and I think that that's important because typically when you have one-on-ones, they somehow transform from career conversations into work conversations every single time. So what I personally like to do is split those two and use the space to actually provide the feedback. But another thing that actually came to mind on how to foster feedback culture within organizations is to act on the feedback. One of the things that many HR leaders are talking about, and I was recently in a panel discussion with HR leaders in Toronto, and we were talking about the feedback that employees are providing through employment surveys, and how very often it is perceived that the feedback that employees are providing is ignored, or nothing is done to it. So one of the ways to actually foster feedback within organizations is to act on it and demonstrate to the employees that we listen to your feedback, we hear it. We're not going to be able to touch on all of the different points, but we are going to continuously deliver on it. So that is the follow-up action on the feedback is going to create trust in the culture of feedback.
And that bi-directionality is I would suggest core to trust, especially if the relationships are within an organization where there's a clear division of labor. And from a leader's perspective, if you have been provided feedback and your teams do not see that feedback moving or informing or having a role in any of the choices, even if it's feedback that is acknowledged and then dismissed, or feedback that is acknowledged and perhaps massaged, or feedback that is delayed, the acknowledgement of the receipt of the information via feedback and that bi-directionality certainly can make a big difference to trust and buy-in and persuasion and influence. I would even suggest to you productivity in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And trust is so critical within the feedback, or any other soft skill really are kind of surrounding this construct of trust. And, what we're talking about within the feedback framework is following through, listening, respecting the individual enough to actually act on feedback, and reciprocating. All of those are components of trust.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would suggest to you that our next question also has ties to trust. And it's a good question. If I say so myself, it's one of my favorites. So let's move our conversation there. And that question reads, what is your favorite way? Now, Konstantin, this is not a way. This is your favorite way, which suggests that there are multiple ways that perhaps you've considered. All right. So what is your favorite way to solve interpersonal conflicts or problems on your team? What do you have in mind?
The biggest thing for me is stepping into their shoes and understanding their point of view. I think that at the core of any conflict is different points of view. And more often than not, I'm realizing that people are more aligned than they actually are different from each other, but they speak a different language. So to sort of translate and create the same language, you would have to step into someone else's point of view, understand what they're saying, and that resolves the conflict in many cases just on its own, because you either realize that you're completely aligned, or you understand what their point of view is, and you know how to solve it, or realigning your own point of view. Or finally, if there is no solution, it also leads to a productive conversation, but at that point, it's less of a conflict but more of a conversation between individuals around their points of view.
I understand. And, it comes back to this conversation idea that I keep talking about, ironically, she said. And the idea here that I find very interesting, that I'm hoping we can spend more time on, is what's often referred to as either the uncomfortable conversation, perhaps a difficult conversation. Sometimes it's referred to as the fierce conversation or the avoidable conversation. However, what I find interesting is that if there is disconnect or conflict, that it is some version of conversation, which means that we have an exchange, right? It's not a monologue, it's not a lecture, it's a conversation. How would you then, in your own work, begin one of those conversations if you do suspect that there's a disconnect or that there's been a conflict brought to your attention?
Typically I take a very direct approach, and I would say a lot of people who know me and know this approach quite well. Is really sitting down and laying out. It's like, hey, we have an issue, and this is the issue. I am perceiving the situation in this way, and maybe coming in from the perspective of humility and really saying it's like, perhaps I am incorrect. Let's have a conversation and figure out what the right solution is. So that is a part of it. But in here, as I'm saying it, I think like one important piece is focusing on the future. A lot of times we tend to focus on what has passed, the mistakes made, the words said, the negative feelings associated with it. I say it's like it's good to draw a line at some point and say, well, okay, we acknowledge that this happened. We're not going to sweep it under the rug or hide it or ignore it. But how do we move forward? Because ultimately, we are aligned on the positive outcome for the organization. We're aligned in positive outcome for yourself and then for myself. So what do we need to do to get to the good place versus kind of stay behind in the past?
I completely echo that approach in my own work. And I would say to you a few comments that come to mind initially is, especially when I'm working with managers who perhaps are of high potential in terms of leadership in an organization, there can be two questions that can assist people in better addressing, managing, and perhaps then developing their conflict resolution skills. And the first question is to stop asking who is to blame and any finger pointing that might be
That's right.
Core, because the answer is of, I would suggest you, minimal, if not absolutely no value whatsoever. And then secondly, answering the question, what happened, so that we can have as much as possible an understanding of the issue, which is one of the first words that you used, right? We have an issue. The other approach that I often ask people to think about is actually us tying our conversation back to our discussions about feedback from a moment ago, which is feedback that focuses on the past is remarkably limited in terms of value. And what I often ask people to do is to think about feeding the future or feed forward. And in that feeding forward approach, there's the possibility of depersonalizing feedback, or if we bring it to our current conversation, the opportunity to depersonalize any in the moment feelings that we may have so that we can focus on what to do next. And I say that because this is not in any way a means of qualifying nor disqualifying any feelings. This is not a promotion nor a negation of anyone's feelings, but it is the acknowledgement that the issue is not people's feelings at work. The issue is the project, the target, the goal, the event,
That's right.
insert your objective here. And so if we refocus people, I've seen in my own practice that we learn to work in tandem with our own feelings. And I've found that oftentimes people have a hard enough time articulating what they may or may not be feeling. Have you found that?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially even if they have an easy time articulating what they're feeling, a lot of times when you start digging into why they're feeling this way, and this is really what's the core is of the feelings and all of the conflict and negative emotions that are arising out of it, and getting to understanding that why is very often the key to resolving the conflict altogether. And it can be difficult because it's an uncomfortable conversation with yourself that you have to answer the questions like, hey, why am I feeling upset about it? Well, it's because Jimmy did something. It's like, well, why is that upsetting? So going deeper into the why and the reasoning very often is going to bring up something within ourselves that's to the surface that is going to help us overcome the conflict itself too.
Certainly. And that self-orientation, that intrapersonal world, so many of us either have spent some time doing that work in trying to figure out what motivates and answers those whys in our lives. And some of us spend a lot of time trying to avoid whatever is interpersonally motivating and informing those whys in our own lives. And I'm not suggesting one is better or worse than the other, but we have some very distinct ways of managing some of our own motivations, and whether or not we choose to dig in terms of what is at the core of some of what can inform our behaviors. So I appreciate that focus then, and it all starts with that approach that you described as a direct one, where we are saying we have an issue here. And I captured those words of yours because there's a very powerful 2-letter pronoun that you started that sentence with. We have an issue. And in terms of conflict, I'm a big proponent of aligning the humans on one side and the issue, whatever it may be, on the other side. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. And this is what I said in the beginning, that a lot of times when you look at the conflict, there's actually no conflict and everyone is aligned, says the same thing, and comes from absolutely different perspectives. One of the benefits, of doing multiple client engagements and, working with executive teams is you very often see the conflict that happens at the executive table. And what you hear is the marketing leader, the HR leader, and the finance leader, they're all saying the same thing, but they each are coming in from their specific perspective. So that is, what does that mean for marketing perspective? What does it mean from HR perspective? What does it mean from financial perspective? And they're making the same point. They're providing the independent observations that are coming from their own area. And ultimately, what they want to see is that other leaders hearing them. Yes. But when every single person wants to be heard, but is not willing necessarily to listen, then it's not going to be attainable, right? That's hey, you understand my perspective, but if the other person wants you to hear their perspective and is not listening, that's also not going to work. So this is where actually listening to what the other person is saying is absolutely critical.
Absolutely, I completely understand, and I think there's also, in fact, I know there's also an irony here, as you pointed out. Each of those leaders, from their own portfolio or point of view, are invested in the collective success.
That's right.
And if we can refocus to that either finance or HR or marketing or communications or whatever table is occupied and those seats at the table as they are represented, if we can refocus on almost the greater good, in a sense, oftentimes these conflicts can bring to the surface how we are choosing to behave might be modified so that we could make more space for each other.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that we did, when I was in consulting, is we would put everything onto the whiteboard or the sticky notes, right? All of the different perspectives, so that people can actually see it, and that provides the visual framework that allows all of those leaders to take a look and say, "Hey, we're actually saying the same thing in here, just coming in from different perspectives. So why don't we take the commonality and look at that, and then we move all of the other unique perspectives to the bottom." And that is like an important thing in here too, is that conflict is not a bad thing, right? It's like, I think people think that conflict is a bad thing, but I think that creative conflict, where people are challenging each other, it is a really, really good thing, right? It brings new perspectives, and quite the opposite, actually. The lack of conflict can be quite alarming, because that either means that there is a fear within the organization or the group that people are not willing to provide that feedback, or that everyone is so aligned that they are creating that groupthink. That's this is one perspective, and there's no other perspective that exists. So I think that the conflict is a sign of balance. And the lack of conflicts very often is a sign of problems.
I, again, have some of my own words echoed in yours. The term creative conflict is one that I use with great abandon, if I say so myself, in the work that I do. And the homogeneity that groups can have, if we have, for example, a traditional hiring practice where we have not sought out for diversity, for diversity of thinking, for neurodiversity, for diversity of perspective, for inclusiveness of other cultures, et cetera, can also bring to the surface that we are missing the opportunity, right? Those points of disconnect, there's opportunity for synergy there, for newness. And sometimes newness takes a bit of a nanosecond for reflection. And we often are hesitant to do so with the possibility of the status quo being questioned, right? And in those cultures that are not nearly as progressive as Top Hat, status quo maintenance can be a lot of what people are doing in the hopes of just keeping it okay.
Absolutely.
So this leads us to our third and I think really important question. In part, we've already touched on, which is, what does success leading others look like to you? And as a VP organizational effectiveness, I'm sure that there are many projects as well as individuals that you are leading. So what does that look like to you when it is successful?
And this is a great question, because there are two perspectives to take a look in here. And one is kind of the outcomes perspective. Did the project actually lead to the outcomes that we're looking for? So that is kind of the numeric values, a lot of measurements and metrics and everything else. But the question really is about leading others. So that is success at the interpersonal perspective. Yep. And the more I am working with different teams, the more I think about kind of unlocking the individuals, right? Allowing them, empowering them to have the ownership in their own domain of expertise, right? So all of these people, and I am coming perhaps from a perspective that people are good, people are trustworthy, people want to deliver their best self and their best work to the organization, and they bring their own expertise and perspectives that need to be fostered and need to be strengthened within the organization. So what I try to do personally is I try to empower my team to solve the problems and to identify the opportunities. If someone is going to come into me and say, hey, I'm identifying this problem with the organization, and I'd like to solve it, and this is how I'm thinking about it, I would ask them to lead this initiative. I don't need to step into the shoes and my role as into the leadership shoes in here and take and lead that initiative. I want the person who brought it to me to really own it, and I want to empower them to be the rock star that they are meant to be, so to speak. And with that, the job of a leader really becomes twofold, and that is to unlock the individual potential. You need to stretch them, but stretch them not until the point that they break. So giving them challenging assignments, helping them grow and learn. And the second piece in here is really eliminating any red tape that they are coming across and helping them eliminate the red tape if they can do that. So that is a part of the unlocking of the leadership potential within others is important. So when I see both of those things, what I see is individuals working and becoming leaders. They're owning things and they are delivering. And this is where the metrics come in after that, right? You empower the individual and they are going to deliver you the metrics that are necessary.
So that's all fantastic. And in your final thought there, maybe is full circle to the very first thoughts that you gave us. You mentioned the outcomes perspective and then the interpersonal perspective. And what I'm understanding is if we invest in the interpersonal perspective, that we can then have a more fruitful, comprehensive outcomes perspective around what the productivity and the process is yielding. Is that
That's
a way
right.
of understanding it? Yeah.
Yeah, and this comes from that perspective of thinking that people actually want to deliver a good job. People want to do a good job. So how can we help them do it as leaders? And that's ultimately what's going to unlock the success.
Konstantin, do you believe that there may be leaders out there who do not have that perspective that individuals want to bring their best selves to work and deliver their best? Do you think there are leaders out there who think to the contrary?
I absolutely think so. Different leaders have different perspectives, and I constantly get surprised with how people behave in different situations. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's contrarian views to my views.
Yes, fair enough. And I appreciate your diplomacy in answering that question. I really appreciated what you said about the individual's domain of expertise. And again, I feel great alignment with your concepts in some of my own work in writing, because I often, especially, I'll tell you right now, Konstantin, with some of the leaders that I am coaching, and I'm spending some of my time with some women leaders in particular right now, that we spend time around this concept of that domain of expertise. And sometimes it's as distilled as recognizing your own value at the virtual or the literal table, and knowing that the value of your point of view is of high quality, and it is not necessarily the same, and I use big air quotes even on a podcast, is not the same as the value potentially that someone else at that table brings. Is that a way of understanding that domain of expertise that you referred to?
I believe that's close enough, right? The way that I think about it is we're bringing the different individuals within the organization with different skills. And there is a reason for why we are bringing them into the organization. So to me as a leader, to come in then and say, hey, I brought you in for your expertise, but I don't think that this is how it works. That kind of defeats the purpose of bringing that individual into the organization in the first place. But yeah, I do think that people need to feel more empowerment within organizations to share their perspectives, their opinions. A lot of times, the quietest person in the room and in the meeting is going to have the most insightful things telling you after the meeting actually happens. And if they just raised their hand and said something in the meeting, that would completely turn around the conversation and perhaps bring something innovative. So I do encourage people to observe, of course, like in a meeting, but also raise their hands and share their perspectives and their views, because the more points of views we have, the easier it is to navigate and to innovate and to come up to the right solution ultimately.
Absolutely. And you and I have come full circle in that we're yet again speaking about the value of conversing and empowering that individual to contribute to that conversation in that meeting or in a feedback conversation or in any of the day in, day out work that we're doing. And I certainly have appreciated our conversation. And as we are wrapping up, Konstantin, I wonder, is there a resource of any sort, a book or a video or any sort of article that you might refer our listeners to that has been significant to some of your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I read multiple things, but I keep coming back to the very classic Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. There's tons of insights, tons of advice. But the interesting thing that every single time I come back to it, I take something different from the book, and I think it's a great resource to revisit, even under consideration that it's been around for so many years.
Yes.
But there's just so much insight about human relationships.
Konstantin, I'm delighted that you mentioned that one. And to my delight and surprise, you are not the first person in 2022 on this podcast to make reference to that book. And it is on my bookshelf. I can tell you I have a dog-eared version, a hard copy version that I was given many, many years ago that I do go back to every once in a while. So I like how reluctant we can be to say, hey, this is an oldie but a goodie or a classic. But if an article or a book is, giving and can bring some enlightenment over time, I'm a big proponent of that. So yeah, that's a great resource for people to be reminded of. And it's been around long enough. It's bound to be in a public library. It's bound to be accessible and certainly Googleable for certain snippets of it as well.
That's right.
Yeah. So Konstantin, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day at Top Hat. I sincerely appreciate you joining me and have greatly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of the Soft Skills Salon podcast.
Likewise. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.